it's good to be here. This topic, I wondered would get a little attention, and obviously it did. First, let me just say that it's an honor to be here. I've heard a lot about the Oxford Union, and so we'll have a chance for some give and take. But I want to give you a little introduction and sort of lead off by saying what goes around comes around. In this case, we had an experience that I was directly involved with, the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And what it takes to impeach a president is you have to have a resolution, and then it goes before the committee, and then you have to have a majority on the committee vote, and then it goes to the floor of the House, and the House votes, and you have to have a majority there. It's like a grand jury. So that's the beginning process. And then to convict, it has to go to the Senate. And that's the second stage. But let me tell you how the two periods are different. And what I mean, what goes around comes around. I came and was elected from a district that was in the Midwest, the Midwestern part of the country. I came from a small town. And we grew up where we would believe our presidents, actually believe them. And whether it was a Republican or Democrat would not make any difference, that we accepted it. And we followed that period. Maybe in some ways those traditions that going back to the traditions of the past, but that's what I grew up with. And when I was elected, the term Watergate happened because there was a break-in at that time in a building. And that break-in took place in the summer, and the campaign was going on at that time. And so I experienced a campaign, but we didn't really talk about Watergate. The constituents hardly raised it. It was a passing fancy. And then we came in, and then there was a hearing, an amazing hearing where one of the staff people, his name was Butterfield, he revealed, which is hard to believe, that the President of the United States was taping all the conversations. So there was a taped record. Unbelievable at the time, and we heard about it. We didn't know what the tape said, but we heard about it. And then, of course, we had, and the reason I'm going to do this because I want to compare the two times, we had what they called the Saturday Night Massacre. And the Saturday Night Massacre was that the one who was the special prosecutor that was looking at the White House and the president, his name was Archibald Cox, a professor from Harvard, the president fired him. And it caused an incredible storm throughout the country. We had a resolution, and the resolution was we should impeach the president. And so those of us on the Democratic side, we caucused. And we caucused and we said, look, we should consider this. The president's vice president, to show you how things change but don't change, he got in trouble. He took money as a governor of the state, and so he resigned. So he resigned, and then we had to appoint who was the vice president. So Nixon now had a new president. His name was Gerald Ford. And now we start the hearings. And these hearings, some of them were public and some of them were closed. But they had an amazing effect on the process because the public was more and more beginning to support impeachment. And the reason I'm giving you this history is because we're going to compare it to where we are today. And so we went through the process and we listened to those tapes. And I grew up, like I said, I grew up where you believed in your president, but I listened to the tapes. And from my experience of understanding Nazi Germany, I felt I was almost listening to some closed tape conversations that were abhorrent. Whether you were at Oxford or whether you were in Iowa or whether you were in Washington, D.C., those conversations were unbelievably out in the open. And who'd ever believe that they'd be recorded? And so we listened to those tapes, and as a result of that tape conversation, the president was impeached 3 times, but different because it was bipartisan. We had the Republicans and the Democrats, and the environment was open, and the institutions of government were supported by the public, which was, I'm raising this because I want to compare it to where we are now, to where you're sitting now. And so we listened to the tapes. We voted for 3 articles of impeachment: obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and not complying with a subpoena for those tapes. I also raised the issue of taxes. And I'm raising taxes because that issue is going to come up again. I raised the issue of taxes because I was told, look, Mezvinsky, why don't you look at taxes? You're on the committee. Take a look at his taxes. And I talked to a former head of the Internal Revenue Service, and they pointed out some facts. And what happened was Nixon paid maybe a few $100s taxes in his first year, a few $100s taxes in his second year, claimed a deduction of over $500,000 that was backdated deed. We had testimony in a closed session, and I asked the prosecutor from the Attorney General's office, if that was you or I, what would you do? And he said, we would prosecute that person and he would be sent away. I sponsored the article on taxes. I wrote a law review article. But unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, whatever, it depends on who's listening or wants it, we had impeached him 3 times, and so the article of impeachment on taxes, we didn't have enough support to pass it. The 5th article was on the bombing of Cambodia, and there was a priest that was on the committee, Father Drinan, and that didn't have the support. So 3 times he was. But also I want to leave you with this. We voted to impeach, and right next to me was a woman, an African-American woman from Texas. Her name was Barbara Jordan. Historically, an incredible woman. Spoke about what it was like to be free, what it was like about this country during slavery. And she spoke about that during the impeachment process. I mentioned to her, and we sat together, and I spoke on the taxes and also on impeachment. And then we finally voted. And after the vote, we cried. We cried. Why? Because we had to remove a president of the United States who disgraced our country. And it was overwhelming. And it had an incredible effect, not only upon us personally, but on our country. And now, let's compare where we are today. And then we'll open it up to questions, and you're welcome to do whatever you wish and ask. But today is a different period. It's toxic. The environment that we're in is toxic in the United States. And the moderate view is not there. So it's partisan, highly partisan. And of course, we just had a recent election, 2018, and changed the complexion of the House. But we had all the Republicans in one time until 2018. So the environment is much different. And what about the press? And what is similar? Well, the press was critical during Nixon. You may have watched the movie with Robert Redford, and you watched the whole impact of what that did. And there you had a person who was revealed privately was the assistant FBI director, and his name was Mark Felt. He didn't give his name, but they used a name called Deep Throat, and he was the source. And that source said, follow the money. And what do we have today? In case you just recently read any of the press, there's a new book out. We call The Threat. The Threat is by the former director of the FBI. And what's significant about it? What did he say about Trump and about that situation? And he was fired the same way that others have been fired in the past. But he was fired by the present occupant of the White House. And what did he just say this past week? He indicated that in a private meeting, the number 2 member of the U.S. Justice Department indicated that when all of this was going on, that he would wear a wire. It's hard to believe. Can you imagine person number 2 in the Justice Department saying that he would wear a wire and go into the White House and record the president because of the activities that were going on within that particular time? And so we have what goes around comes around. Here, a special prosecutor is fired under Nixon. James Comey is fired under Trump. We have a U.S. attorney, then number 2 in the Justice Department, who's raising questions under the 25th Amendment of removal of the president. And then we have the unusual story, and watch this as it unfolds. You have an investigation report that's going to come out very shortly, the Mueller report. And you have what impact that's going to have, and what's it going to do, and how do you remove a president? Do you have to have criminality? Does high crimes and misdemeanors indicate it has to be a crime? Technically not, under the founders of our Constitution. It does not have to be a crime. But in the case of Trump, realistically, if there's any chance of impeachment, the report and the evidence will have to show criminality. And that will be a major, major step. Or it'll have to show treason. Treason because of the impact of the Russians and the relationship with the Russians. And there's one press that said open treason when they described the present president when he met in Helsinki. So we're seeing that difference. Also, I want you to pay attention if you can. When we experienced the impeachment of Richard Nixon, we had his consul to the White House, James Dean. James Dean testified in closed session before our committee, and what did he say? He said that there was a cancer in the presidency. The cancer in the presidency, and that was the cutting edge. And he blew the whistle. And that was a major import in terms of moving the process. So what do we have today? We have the consul, not to the president, but consul to the then candidate for many years, Michael Cohen. Michael Cohen is going to be testifying before the Congress in the next week. He was recently sentenced to go to jail because he had a house arrest, and they convicted him for tax fraud and for using the process called hush money. And I mention hush money because hush money was one of the reasons that Nixon was removed from office. He was removed from office because he tried to pay off those that broke into Watergate. So what do we have when we look at the two in the environment? You had institutions which building up support, which allowed the committee and I as a member to vote for impeachment. And what do we have today? Today, the environment is not the same. The environment is much more toxic, much more partisan, but you have similarities. You have people blowing the whistle. You have hush money that was paid for Stormy Daniels. And Michael Cohen indicated that. And what did he do in the pleadings? The pleadings listed what they call number one that gave the direction for the hush money. So who's number one? President Trump. And he is very likely to be what they call an unindicted co-conspirator, the same way that Nixon was an unindicted co-conspirator. And let me leave you with this. In a very short time, there's going to be a report by Mueller. And he's going to take this investigation on the Russians, on the criminality that may have taken place, obstruction of justice. Many were indicted, some, including his chairman of his committee, including his national security lead that left, Michael Flynn. And you're going to have to, and there's going to be people that are going to expect that this report's going to be a panacea. It's going to give all the answers. But in many ways, it may not. It may be a short report. And it may simply set the stage for investigations. So I'm simply saying to you here at Oxford, keep your eyes open. There's similarities between the two events, but the environment is not the same, and the climate is different, and hopefully we'll be able to have an open discussion and an open debate about the likelihood of whether the impeachment process will be relevant to Donald Trump. I'm glad I can be here.
Thank you so much for the speech, Ed. That was incredibly insightful. So I wanted to start off, I think, by actually taking a step back and looking not at the practicalities of impeachment, but at the kind of philosophical implications behind it. So what do you think the purpose of impeachment should be?
Well, the purpose, that goes deeply into why you even start the process. The purpose is, impeachment was meant by the founders, and by the way, it goes back to Britain. It goes back to, and this isn't the time where they say that the king is dead, the king is alive, the king is back again, repeating itself. No, impeachment was meant, in case anyone there's corruption, using the office for private gain, treason, trying to do things that adversely affect our country. And that was the purpose of impeachment. It didn't necessarily have to be a crime. You had to have members, as I said, a majority of the members had to vote that they say he did a disservice to our Constitution, to liberty and freedom, and to our democracy. And that's the main thrust of it. The thrust is, what did the president do? And by the way, impeachment isn't just for the president. It's for anyone in high office or anyone that, and also judges. Judges can be removed in the same way. So it's a process that is political, but also, and it's judicial, but in many ways, we wouldn't have had or been able to even pass the impeachment and make it bipartisan if we wouldn't have exposed some of the points that I raised. Because you need public support. You have to, it takes guts for certain members of the president's party to break with him. And we had Republicans break with Nixon, but you don't see much breaking of the present Republicans in terms of the present president, but that doesn't mean that if they think that they may be subject to not getting reelected, they may decide to break. But impeachment is basically, the founders meant it to subvert our Constitution and liberty and convince a majority of the House to support it. But it didn't have to be a crime. It could be something that could be separate from crime, but it basically subverts the process.
So it seems to me that it's especially, there's a process of removing a president which is an election.
Right.
But the purpose of impeachment is that before there's time for an election,
right.
there's been such a subversion of the democratic norms that it's right for Congress to remove the president. It seems to me that's quite clear what the process is. Then why haven't House Democrats at the moment started the process to impeach?
Yeah. Did everybody hear that question? Because it's a critical one. It's a critical question of why haven't Democrats just jumped on board? Trump, you have, when you look at his public statements, there's thousands of misstatements you can point out. When he went to Helsinki and met with Putin, some of the press said it was open treason. And we discovered that there's no notes. He didn't allow anyone to take notes at that. And even the translators had to turn in their notes. So you had one of the New York papers said that was open treason. So the whole question of what does it take to move it, and why haven't the Democrats jumped on it? Well, there have been some resolutions. The same way we had it before, there's a resolution to impeach him. But you got to have the committee move it. And if you're going to be effective, it has to be bipartisan. Because in many ways, and there was a recent book done by a law professor from Harvard, Lawrence Tribe, which basically points out that if you go through impeachment and you're not successful, it may reinforce the one you're trying to impeach. And it could make your life even more difficult. And unfortunately, with this president, he basically feels that he's above the law. He basically feels that he's his own attorney general. And that's a major issue. So the Democrats have held back, wanting to get more evidence out in the open and getting the public to begin to support, which happened in my instance, support the process. Because it's not only legal, but it's public. And you've got to get support from the public to carry the process. And at the same time, you've got to convince members of the president's own party to seriously look at the issue. And it was a major breakthrough to have Republicans support the impeachment of Richard Nixon. And they did, but we got along. It was much different. I could communicate with the other side. They could communicate with me. And we could be much more open. And we could have an open debate, as you hopefully have here. But we could do it, and it happened. But the climate is different. So the reason that Pelosi, the Speaker, and the leadership have held is that we're not there yet. It doesn't look like we've broken it. Let's wait for the Mueller report. Let's see if there's more evidence to show that he really perhaps committed a crime, and perhaps whether it's treason in terms of the Russian activity. Let's wait for that report. Let's wait for the evidence. Now, what happened when we did with Richard Nixon, there was a special prosecutor. His name was Jaworski. And when he finished his report, he directed it to the chairman of our committee. And that report was out there for us to read. It was open. It was public. And you could read it, and you could see what the president did. And even though Nixon went on TV and said, "I am not a crook," which is almost a classic line, but he said, "I am not a crook," and he said it more than once, and he put his fingers up in the air. Okay, but he said it, but the report shows, and what I listened to on tape says that he should be removed from office. And what happened was, the committee voted to impeach, so you'll know, but members of the president's own party, which is one of the reasons why the Democrats have held back. One was Goldwater and two or three other Republicans. They went to the White House and said, "Mr. President, not only are you going to be impeached, which is the House action, but you're going to be convicted in the Senate. And if you're convicted in the Senate, you lose your pension, you lose everything, you're going to be even more disgraced. So immediately when they walked in there, he got word and he resigned. And so the reason the Democrats are holding off now is simply we're waiting for the report, waiting for a little more evidence, and then we can be more credible. And the chairman of the committee, his name is Nadler, has clearly indicated that upon that report that they will seriously look at it. Also, we have good chairmen, different than the last Congress, which happened in this election, to show you why the votes make a big difference. I mean, we had a judge on the Supreme Court, his name was Louis Brandeis, who said, look, what you need is, you need air, you need something to move the process, to make it happen. And that's really what's happening now. They're waiting to see if it happens. And the report, in all candor, may not be all that strong, but what it may allow is it may allow us to further investigate. And then there's a difference too, you should understand. And Dan mentioned, you know, there's an election. People say, well, why don't you just wait? Wait for 2020. It's going to be soon. And we'll have 2020 and the public can remove him from office. It's cleaner. There's no questions. It's not partisan. It's out in the open. So there's that argument out there. Just wait. With Nixon, it was his second term, and the environment was different, and the pressure was different, and the evidence, we had the tapes. We're not going to have tapes with Trump. There are no tapes. That's one thing we learned. That's one thing that the president's learned. We're not going to record those. But little did he know that he'd have his number 2 person in the Justice Department threaten to come in with a wire. Can you believe that? It's hard to believe. And this is a Republican. His name is Rosenstein, who said because they were worried about what Trump was doing, that he was prepared, at least he said, but the question is, was he serious? He was prepared to go in for a wire and record the president. Tells you how the climate is somewhat different from
then
before.
It seems as though the whole process of impeachment rests on bipartisan support.
Right.
So the House Democrats need to know that there will be sufficient bipartisan support to even begin the process. But we live in a post-bipartisan age.
Right.
So they know that none of that exists. So is impeachment dead in the water before they could even start it?
Well, realistically, as I described it, if you're just sitting here today at Oxford, and we were in a debate society and we had that argument, is it realistic? It's very difficult, but I put 2 caveats. I think they have to demonstrate in this report that there was criminality, that there was really overt criminality. Or they can show it was treason, what he did with the Russians, and what he's saying and still going on with the Russians, and knowing that that happened, and still communicating, and why. And now revelations are coming out about how they wanted to build a tower in Moscow, and how Putin was going to get a $50 million penthouse suite at the time. And Michael Cohen, which is interesting. Michael Cohen, who's the consul, was there, and now he's testifying. And friends of mine who represent him know that he's going to spill the beans. He's going to talk. And just like, which shows you, you had John Dean, counsel to the president, who really made it the cutting edge to have it happen, and whether Michael Cohen will do it. And as a result, there may be the criminality. And one other quick thought would be that when Trump was confronted with the payments made to the woman, Stormy Daniels, and the name may be familiar, may not be familiar, but I don't know if she'll be a speaker here or something.
She spoke a year ago.
Oh, yeah, right. That's what I thought. That's what I thought. She's a speaker here. So I don't know whether, but at that time, when she spoke, when Trump was asked on the airplane, when he was flying on Air Force One, well, what about this Stormy Daniels? Do you know anything about it? No. I don't know anything about it. You'll have to You have to ask Michael Cohen. And then we discover, with pleadings and with the prosecution made in the state of New York by the U.S. attorney in that district, that not only were payments made, but his own counsel acknowledged that they were at the direction of and knowledge of the president. He wasn't president then, but he didn't want to have that come out. So you had hush money, which was the grounds which we used to impeach Nixon on obstruction of justice. In a similar way, hush money was sent. But now, the argument could be, well, that's just financial crime. That's just financially. That's not a major issue. But in a way, it's the beginning of how you step up the ladder to show criminality. And it's just a process. But if I had the vote today without the Mueller report and without more evidence, it would be an academic exercise. And also, too, you have a difference with this president and Nixon. This president, in many ways, views the law and his U.S. attorneys as his U.S. attorneys. Not the country, not the Attorney General for the United States of America, but his. And so he got upset with Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General, because he put himself under and said, I got to remove myself from this prosecution. In a way, what Trump has said is that he is the law. And no president can be impeached because he is the law unto himself. He's the President of the United States. So the quick answer would be, if I was sitting here today without any Mueller report, you won't have any bipartisan support. But the more that's coming out, at least there's the thought, with more evidence, with more information, that those members of his party who want to stay in office will begin to break ranks. As what happened in this last election, 2018, you saw that the Congress, almost 40 new members, moved Republican seats into the Democratic column. So it's survival. That's why impeachment is a political event. It's survival. And so ideally, is it just, are we in an ivory tower just debating this issue? No. You have to have public support. And the other issue that I touched on is that the institution itself has to be supported. And look, you're dealing with your own issue here with Brexit and the support and your prime minister and so forth. But you have to demonstrate that the environment is such. The Congress ranking for Congress in the public is 11% right before the election. That's the public support of Congress as an institution. Now, when we ended up impeaching Nixon, the public support was over 50%. That tells you the climate that's different. Also, let's talk about taxes. Over 60% of the public believes that a president should disclose their taxes. That it should be a given, because past presidents have done it. Nixon disclosed his taxes, but he committed fraud in the filing of those taxes. In the case of Trump, he hasn't, but now the Democrats are chair of the committee, and they're very well going to force his returns to come out in the open. So there's a lot of steps that could come out that may change the climate. But the climate, as we sit here today on February 22nd, is very difficult, but the process moves. It's like any process, so the feeling is that there'll be steps to investigate and the climate may be better. But it's not, but as I said, the environment is much more toxic and much more partisan. So it's probably, it's much more difficult. And as you move closer to 2020, there will be those that say, well, look, why should we impeach? Why should we remove him? We'll do it during the normal election process. And how do you expect to remove him when the members of his own party or in the Senate control the majority. So those are the, the back and forth plays that go on. But the more comes out in the open, there's several things that could happen. A, it could move it, and the committee may hold the hearings the same way we did. Or it may be so embarrassing. It may bring in members of the president's family that may be subject to prosecution. They are now looking at the inauguration committee. The inauguration committee raised more money, multi-millions of dollars, than had ever been raised before, and it was viewed by some and by the prosecution as being a slush fund. So more and more facts come out. It may have a bearing on whether he wants to stay in office voluntarily.
So then my final question before we hand over to the audience is, even if Mueller publishes and the evidence is to such a high bar that it would give rise to the House Democrats to begin the process, and they know that it's unlikely with the bipartisan support of the Republicans in the Senate to vote for it, as we head into 2020 and Donald Trump's rhetoric is going to be running against Congress again and against the elites, do you think the House Democrats look at this and think that if they began the process of impeachment, like what happened with Clinton, it would only actually further increase Donald Trump's popularity and hinder the election chances?
That's a valid point, and that's where writers are talking. They're saying, if you can't get and make it bipartisan, it could actually boomerang. And that's what they said in terms of the other attempt to impeach a president with Clinton, which was partisan and failed. And so the worry is it could boomerang and perhaps strengthen the other side. So that's sort of the delicate weave and balance that goes on. And I think realistically you shouldn't, there was just an interesting op-ed piece that appeared in the Times today, and it gave the argument that that doesn't mean that you don't seriously look at this report, no matter what it says, because it's going to open the door to more investigations. There's more coming out. Everything is coming out in different ways. That doesn't mean that they'll be successful. And also there's a difference. This president, look, how many presidents have ever classified, I don't know if you view it with the London Times, but would call the New York Times the enemy of the people. That's what he just said. Now, why did he say it? The enemy of the people is the New York Times. And the press, he calls it the fake press. And why does he say it? Because they've just come out with a long, extensive article, appeared in the last week, where they interviewed members of his administration, friends that knew what went on, and what did it show? It showed that he asked his then acting attorney general to go to the U.S. attorney in the state of New York and try to substitute a different person, which was exactly the reason that we voted to impeach Richard Nixon, because he did this, obstruction of justice, similarities in many ways. But you've got a president this time that just goes unbelievably hard against the press. And the press has done really an amazing job of this. They've exposed the whole issue of the Russians, the campaign, 2008, 2016, and everything like that. The same way that we had the press where we had people come out and make a tremendous difference in terms of Watergate. So that's where we are today, and little did we know in my time, even then and now, and having the experience, that I would classify a paper that's probably as tough and as respected as any press in the country, wins more Pulitzer Prizes than any paper in the country, and called the enemy of the people.
Then let's move over to questions from the audience. If you'd like to stick your hand up and ask a question and wait for the microphone to be brought to you. Right. Sir, let's go to your hand there.
Great.
First of all, thank you very much for your talk, sir. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I I just wondered, sort of looking at other presidents who there's sort of been talk of impeachment, was there ever, in your mind, a case for impeaching Ronald Reagan over Iran-Contra?
Well, repeat the last part of the question.
I said, I'm talking about other presidents who could have been impeached. Do you think there was ever a coherent case for impeaching Ronald Reagan over the Iran-Contra scandal?
Well, there was attempts. There were people that wrote about it. Yeah, there were people that brought it up. There were those that wanted to impeach George Bush because of the war, because of Iraq, going into Iraq, and also saying there were weapons of mass destruction there in Iraq, and they didn't find any weapons of mass destruction. So yes, there were. They go back. There were tens. It's not easy. It's a very difficult process. It has to be bipartisan. The closest it came was when it went back to Andrew Johnson, which was right after Lincoln, and he was impeached, and then he just lost by one vote from being convicted. So there have been other cases, and let me say this without question: if Hillary Clinton would have won in 2016, and the Congress was what it was in 2016, heavily Republican on both sides, who felt that the emails and all of that, and they still want to prosecute her, they would have, without question, put it through the process, and she would have been impeached in the House because of the partisanship and the dynamic. She very well may not have been impeached in the Senate, be convicted because you had to have 2/3. That shows that it's a political environment. It's highly political. The same way that Andrew Johnson came out of the Civil War and he did some things that were felt contrary to what the Union wanted. And so it depends. Ronald Reagan, Iran-Contra, yes. And people were indicted. But to be successful, you have to have good investigation. The Nixon environment was pretty unusual. And also, we had the tapes. Don't underestimate the evidence of listening to tapes. And that was one hell of a battle for us to even hear the tapes, because he didn't want to release it. And what did he do? He gave us transcripts. He played the game, give us transcripts, and then he would redact them, what was criminal. And the case went up, and went up all the way to the Supreme Court. And very interestingly enough, we voted 3 times to impeach, but we listened to some of the tapes. But we subpoenaed the rest of the tapes. And when the Supreme Court ruled that those tapes had to be open and revealed, even the hardcore Republicans on our committee that said this was just, this was out of hand, you're just going after the president, they couldn't hide. They couldn't hide because it was so open, and the tapes did it. And then but we did it before that because we had enough bipartisan support to make it happen. Do we have tapes against Trump? No. Do we have a lot of evidence that's different? Yes. Is it enough to impeach the president? Doubtful now. Perhaps if the case is stronger, it'll go to a vote in the House.
And then let's take another question. Was there a hand just behind? We'll go 2 rows behind, and then to you, sir.
Good. Thanks all for coming. Really interesting talk about impeachment there. Just wondering about the likelihood of this Mueller report and its effect on the impeachment of Trump. How likely do you think it would happen, and then what effect would that have on the Republican Party, do you think?
Let me repeat the question, make certain I heard it right. What effect would the impeachment of Trump have on the Republican Party? Yeah. Well, that goes to the core. That question really goes to the core of whether he's going to be impeached. Because if in fact, And it's no different whether you're in England and you're threatened or whether you're in the United States. But if, in fact, it reflects badly on the Republican Party, then those in office are going to be under a microscope. And their constituents will hold them accountable, which is what the process is all about, to be held accountable. So it could have a major effect. And that's why when you look at votes, what happened and what's happening now on the congressional races. What happened? Why did so many Republicans get thrown out of office in 2018? Because the Congress rating was very low. The public looked at it as that. The Democrats had some good candidates, and they began to focus on health care, work, jobs, which were cutting-edge issues, and they got elected. So the bottom line question, which you really go to the core, is the Republican Party, if it feels they're threatened with the evidence, they'll start to break ranks. And that's where some of the Democrats that believe in impeachment are hoping that the evidence will be such that they'll break ranks. If they don't break ranks, to go through the exercise, as other writers and others have said, could be problematic and could perhaps allow Trump to perhaps get reelected in a way because it's viewed as highly partisan and it reinforces all the negatives.
And then, yeah, let's jump across the aisle to the hand over here if we can.
Good.
Thank you very much. Good evening, and thank you very much. I've been fortunate enough to meet or be in the company of several American politicians over the years, and I'm fairly convinced that of all of them, you are going to answer the first part of my question. That is, who really did shoot Kennedy? And
what?
Who really did shoot Kennedy?
Okay.
And the second one, you mentioned about impeachment of the judiciary. In 2 weeks' time, Clarence Thomas will have spent 10,000 days on the Supreme Court benches. Okay, for those old enough to remember it, Barbara Watkins was at #1 with It's My Party, and the Police were #1 in the album charts with Ghost in the Machine. Do you think the longevity of the Supreme Courts, of the Supreme Court justices, are themselves a problem in the justice system?
Yeah, let me answer that first, and I'll give it a say. Yeah. First of all, there is a move to put term limits on Supreme Court justices for that very reason. As you know, I mean, and not just for the reasons of philosophy, from a judicial philosophy, but just in terms of competence, looking at things, and so forth. So there's serious discussion of that. Is it likely to happen real quickly? Not, but there's been more and more discussion. It's coming out. The Clarence Thomases of the world, and what that represented, and also the Me Too movement and the women's rights and those hearings. There's more talk of that. Okay, there's much more talk. And personally, I think it would be a step in the right direction to find some kind of a way so you don't have the Clarence Thomases stay on forever until they literally can't walk into the chambers. Now, the first question is the assassination of JFK, right? Did I hear that right? Well, you know, the reason that's an interesting question in terms of my reaction. I'll tell you, and I'll be open in terms of how I've evolved on that issue. The best man, one of my closest friends, sat on that committee and was legal counsel for that committee. His name was David Bellin. David Bellin, a brilliant lawyer, and handled my trust fund as well. And I put my interest in trust, different than what we're debating now. I felt that was the right thing to do, to financially do that. So David Bellin sat on the committee, integrity plus. You wouldn't find anybody with greater integrity, graduated #1 at his law school and everything. David Bellin was on and investigated and was one of the leading investigators. He did a book. And he did a book, and it was basically defending the single bullet theory. Okay? And so here I am. I respect David. He's close to him. I'm very close to him. And unfortunately, he had an accident and passed away. But I believed it. I mean, you know, he gave me the argument. He wrote the book. It's a thick book. It's written to it. And he defended the single bullet theory. And I sort of gone through accepting that. And I'm not a kid anymore, so I accepted that. And then even though there were others, including Tip O'Neill and some others there that began to question it, the assassination. And even though Justice Warren was head of it. But of late, I ran into somebody who was from Cuba. And he was brilliant. And he's an academic in an environment where I am. And he all of a sudden started to flood me with materials looking at the case. And I just want to leave you with, it raises some real questions in my mind regarding some of the evidence and how it was handled. And so I'm not in the same position I was when my dear friend David Bellin, I just automatically accepted it. And like a lot of people did. Now I look at it with some of the evidence and some of the testimony, and now the overall reports are coming out, and some of the witnesses are coming out. And so we're looking at it a little differently. So I guess really where I am is objectively, there's some legitimate questions raised about it, which I didn't accept at the beginning. A, because of friendship, and because of my respect for the one who led the investigation. I'd never questioned his integrity. I'd never questioned his ethics. And he was a Republican that questioned Republicans and everything. But now, with the evidence that's been brought to me on some of the reports, I'm beginning to say, well, maybe there's something we should look at a little differently. And that's where I'm coming down. I haven't crossed the bridge 100%, but I'm much more open on that issue than I ever was before.
Thank you. And then, yeah, let's jump to the hand. Two rows in front. You, madam.
Wow, okay. I didn't expect that question, but it's good.
I didn't expect an answer, if I'm honest.
I hope I gave you a frank answer. Okay.
Hi. Thank you so much for the insightful talk. As the news reports have slowly unfolded, we know that there are multiple avenues of misconduct on the part of the Trump administration. I was wondering what you felt would perhaps end up being the most compelling to both Congress and the public if the impeachment process were to happen.
Sure, that's a good.
Thank you.
Let's look at the definition. Bribery, treason, high crimes and misdemeanors. Let's talk about treason. Is it going to reach the level of treason with the Russians? The Russians? The president does not even acknowledge what his intelligence agencies have done. They've said without question the Russians were involved in this election and they really invaded our electoral process. And without question. And the one who's now the CIA head, Central Intelligence Agency, his name is Dan Coates, a former member of Congress in Indiana. He has just testified and confirmed that the Russians were there And they're still doing it. And he did that, and Trump has indicated that he very well may fire him. The same way he fired James Comey from the FBI, who was looking at Flynn and looking at the role of Trump. So the Russian investigation and what it represents and what's revealed, and then also if you're able to listen and read the testimony that Michael Cohen, the one who was his counsel when he was private, he went to Russia. He dealt with the Russians. He was directly involved. He's now going to come out and testify. Let's see and hear what he says. If he points out that Trump was overwhelmingly involved and he checked with him every inch of the way whenever he traveled to Russia, then that would bring that issue more and more to the forefront. And that could have an effect on the Republicans. So that is a critical issue. The other one is obstruction of justice, which is what the New York Times did this piece. And if you ever have a chance, it's a long piece. It's done with writers that are Pulitzer Prize-winning writers. It just came out the last week. It testified, they had witnesses that testified about all that Trump did and was going on in terms of the process, obstructing justice, and how he had his then Attorney General try to obstruct justice in a prosecution that went on in the state of New York, which affected Michael Cohen, who's ultimately going to go to jail. That is a major issue that could have a bearing on obstruction of justice and what he's done. He hasn't hidden it. What he said is that he's above it, that he's the law. There's no such thing as obstruction of justice for a president of the United States, which is a rather unique characteristic and definition. But that's what he said. So those are critical steps. There's some other issues that he's done, the payments, using other people, the money, the hush money. The hush money is a very critical issue, but it's an election issue. But it'll have to show criminality. In other words, if it was somebody else out there, without question, they would be prosecuted and would go to jail. Now, it raises a question. Can a president be indicted? Which was a question that we faced with Nixon. Can you indict a president of the United States while he's in office? It's a critical question. It hasn't been done. There have been reports that were made that no, you can't do that. You have to wait. And you wait until he's out. But it has not been definitive. There's nothing been definitive, and there's those that are looking at it now saying, yes, it's a possible. It could be. I'm not saying that he would be indicted, but if it clearly shows criminality, and you do have some of the Republicans begin to split because they're concerned about their party and whether they'll stay in office, then that could have a major bearing on whether he stays in office, whether it's voluntarily or involuntarily. So those are the steps that I think is important in my mind. You need criminality for Nixon, the same way we had it with him. You need it with Trump, or you need some kind of perhaps treasonous activity with the Russians that will cause the public as well as members of his party to say, hey, enough is enough. Now, the other thing that I could touch on is money. Money in politics. Okay? In the UK, at least, you have shorter elections. You don't fund the elections the same way we do. We had a Supreme Court decision called Citizens United. And when I was in Congress, when I was on the committee, money was paid, but it was under the table. You wouldn't know about it. It was under the table. So what would happen with Nixon is the fundraiser would go to a fundraiser in Florida and would say, we'd like for your contribution, will you give $1 million? And the person says, yeah, I'll give $1 million. But I'd like to be ambassador to Great Britain or France. And the person would respond, it's hard to believe, say, nah, not for $1 million. Maybe the Dominican Republic, but not the leading European countries. But now, because of Citizens United, those contributions are open. You can give unlimited amounts of money. And that's what they're investigating with the inaugural committee, with the amount of money and where it came from. Also, they're saying it came from Russians, from highly placed Russians that gave contributions to the inauguration committee. And if you look at the Mueller report, he indicted a number of Russians for being involved in different activities that adversely affected the United States. So, in quick summary, I would say you should have criminality of some sort, maybe the activity with the Russians that is treasonous, and it has to be overt and clearly shown, and I'd follow the money. And that's why the tax issue. That's what happened with when we had this person, and he said, follow the money. And we followed the money with Nixon. We followed the burglars. We followed where they put the money. We followed the hush money, where it went. And that is, many ways, what we have today. The only difference is the political environment is somewhat different and much more toxic.
And I think we've got time for one final question. So yeah, let's come to the hand on the front row. Just wait for the microphone.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your talk today.
Yeah.
On the topic of money, how do you think there's been a lot of focus on the influence of corporate PACs and lobbyists in US politics today. How do you see that role evolving over the next decade or so? Do you think it's too ingrained in the current political system, or is there any chance that that influence can be limited?
Well, it's really the cutting edge. It's the cutting edge to all this discussion. What it takes to run for office. I mean, we aren't talking, and also, to be on the airwaves. They aren't public airways. You have to pay for that. And now they raise incredible sums of money. But also now it's more sophisticated with social media, and so you can raise small contributions and raise significant sums of money. But that case, the Citizens United case, has a major impact on the political process. And unless there's some change in the legal precedents, that may not change the whole ball game. But there's more debate of that issue. And the Trump story is a factor. So the way you move a political process on corruption and money is to expose it, to give it light. You've got to give it light. And that's what I meant by the Justice Brandeis. He says, give it light. If you give it light, you not only give it light, but you'll have electric that will be a policeman. And so that's where we are today. And that question which we end on is really the cutting edge of what it's all about. And when I'll tell you what I had, with this was just unusual. With Nixon, as I said, it was below the table. It was done, you wouldn't know about it. And they would do it, and it was open, it was cash. There wasn't anything even slightly done. It was just cash on the table. And it was put in safety deposit boxes. And they put it in Florida in a safety deposit box and with jewels for Nixon's wife. And it was done with a person by the name of Bibi Rebozo. And so I looked at that, I followed the money and the taxes, and now, unfortunately, you have a legal opinion by the Supreme Court of the United States that says, well, you shouldn't discriminate. Why, you should be able to give as much as you want to. And now what you have is who decides to run for office. And so you have people that are independently wealthy enough to run. They don't have to raise money. And they talk about, well, I'll spend $100 to $150 million and I'll run myself. I don't have to depend on anybody else. And I'm clean. That way I'm clean. I'm clean because I don't have to ask anybody. It's my money. So don't question me. And, you know, you have one candidate that may surface. I don't know whether he's really going to do it, but if you go to Starbucks, you have Starbucks here, of course, and the one who founded Starbucks is Howard Schultz, and he's thinking about running. And his answer was, well, shouldn't be anything wrong. I'll just use my own money, and I'll pay for the campaign. And so that goes to the crux of the problem, and maybe it's the crux of why we got into trouble in the first place. Why you have these issues and why we're having this debate about impeachment. It is money. It's money in politics. It's corruption. It's where it comes from. It's hush money to keep people silent so that they won't, those that break into Watergate, you take care of them. Or Stormy Daniels, a woman that you had a relationship with that you don't want to tell anybody about. So you give her $150,000 and you give another woman another $120,000. And then you have the Enquirer, the National Enquirer, say do what they call a funny business with stories. So they pay the money so they won't print the story. So this is the game that we have in politics now. And we hope that with giving it light, that we can expose it, talk about the issues like we're doing here, and bring the process out into the open. And if you bring the process out into the open, one of the founders was Thomas Paine, which was of our country, and he said that to go through the agony of democracy, you have to deal with the fatigue of the process. And that's where we are today. And thank you for being here. It's great I could come.
What a note to end on. Thank you.